5,000 years ago, in the land between two rivers, scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets. They wrote of gods who descended from the heavens. They wrote of beings called the Anunnaki, who came to Earth when humanity was young. And buried within these ancient accounts, hidden in translations that scholars have debated for over a century, are descriptions of something extraordinary. A weapon, a divine instrument of such terrible power that it could reduce mountains to dust, flatten cities in moments, and reshape the very face of the earth. Tonight, we journey into the oldest written records in human history to uncover what the Sumerians truly recorded about the Anunnaki and their mountain-flattening weapon. 5,000 years ago, in the land between two rivers, scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets, and they wrote of gods who descended from the heavens, and they wrote of beings called the Anunnaki, who came to Earth when humanity was young. And buried within these ancient accounts, hidden in translations that scholars have debated for over a century, are descriptions of something extraordinary. A weapon, a divine instrument of such terrible power that it could reduce mountains to dust, flatten cities in moments, and reshape the very face of the earth tonight. We journey into the oldest written records in human history to uncover what the Sumerians truly recorded about the Anunnaki and their mountain-flattening weapon. And so, let us begin by stepping back through the ages to a time before our modern world existed in any recognizable form, before the great empires that fill our history books rose and fell before Rome spread its dominion across the Mediterranean. Before the philosophers of Greece walked through their marble colonnades, before the pharaohs of Egypt raised their first pyramid on the desert plateau, there was something else, something older, something that would give birth to so much of what we now call civilization. There was Sumer, and the land of Sumer was not a harsh desert as we might picture the Middle East today, but rather a garden, a fertile expanse of green, and growing things fed by two great rivers that flowed down from the mountains of the north, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And these two rivers cradled something unprecedented between their banks: the birth of written memory, the emergence of cities, the dawn of recorded history. And if you were to travel to this region today, you would find much of it dry and brown, scarred by millennia of changing climate and human conflict. But close your eyes and let yourself drift back to what it once was, and imagine fields of barley ripening under a warm sun, and date palms swaying in gentle breezes, and the sounds of a busy city drifting across irrigated canals, where boats laden with goods float lazily toward the market. This was the Fertile Crescent. This was the cradle of civilization. And here, in this garden between the rivers, human beings first began to write down their thoughts, their laws, their prayers, and their memories of the gods. And we know about this world because of clay, because of the simple, remarkable fact that when you press a mark into wet clay and let it dry, that mark can survive for thousands upon thousands of years. The dry climate of Mesopotamia preserved these tablets like nowhere else on Earth. And so, while the wooden records of other cultures rotted away and the papyrus scrolls of Egypt crumbled to dust, the clay tablets of Sumer endured, waiting in the ruins of buried cities for archaeologists to unearth them millennia later. And this is how we know what the ancients knew. This is how their voices reach us across the vast gulf of time, through marks pressed into clay by hands that turned to dust before the pyramids were built. And the question that pulls us forward tonight is a simple one. What did they know? What did these ancient people record in their thousands upon thousands of tablets that might change how we understand our own past? And to answer that question, we must first understand who the Sumerians were, and to understand what these people wrote about the Anunnaki. We must first understand who they were, and the Sumerians are one of history's great mysteries, because we do not truly know where they came from. Their language, which scholars call Sumerian, is what linguists term a language isolate, which means it is not related to any other known language on Earth, not to the Semitic languages like Akkadian and Hebrew that would later dominate the region, not to Indo-European languages like Persian and Greek, not to any language family we can identify. And this is remarkable because languages almost always have relatives. They branch off from common ancestors, like limbs on a great tree, but Sumerian stands alone, its roots hidden in the mists of prehistory, and the Sumerians themselves had stories about their origins, stories that spoke of a time before the Great Flood, when kingship descended from heaven and the first cities were founded by beings who were more than human. But wherever they came from, the Sumerians achieved things that would shape the entire future of human civilization. They invented the wheel, that simple revolutionary circle that made transportation and pottery and countless other technologies possible. They invented the plow that allowed farmers to cultivate more land and grow more food and support larger populations. They invented the sailboat that harnessed the wind for travel and trade. They gave us the 60-minute hour and the 360-degree circle. Their mathematical system, based on the number 60, still structures how we measure time and angles today. And perhaps most importantly, they invented writing, or at least they invented the earliest writing system we can fully decipher the script we call cuneiform named for. The wedge-shaped marks made by pressing a reed stylus into wet clay and cuneiform was so useful, so adaptable, that it continued to be used for more than 3,000 years, adopted by civilization after civilization, long after the Sumerians themselves had faded into history. The Akkadians used it, and the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Hittites and the Persians, all of them pressing their own languages into clay, using the system the Sumerians had created. And the Sumerians did not invent writing by accident. They developed it systematically in schools called idabas, which means tablet houses where young scribes trained for years to master the thousands of signs and their combinations. Scribes were respected professionals essential to the functioning of temples and palaces and businesses, and they wrote everything. They recorded receipts, for barley and livestock, and they recorded legal contracts and court proceedings, and they recorded letters between merchants and officials, and they recorded hymns and prayers and myths and epics, and they recorded lists, endless lists of words and objects and places and gods, because the Sumerians believed that nothing truly existed until it was named and written. They believed that writing was not merely a tool, but a sacred gift. And in their view, the gods had given humanity writing as a gift, a way to speak across the centuries, a way to fix thought into permanent form, a way to make the fleeting eternal, and their cities rose from the river mud, great centers of population and culture and religion cities, whose names echo down through history. Or the birthplace, according to the Bible, of Abraham Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh, the great hero king, whose epic would be retold for millennia. Eridu, considered by the Sumerians themselves to be the oldest city in the world, the first place where kingship descended from heaven. Nippur, the religious center, where Enlil, the lord of wind and storm, held court in his great temple. And in these cities the Sumerians built great stepped towers that rose above the flat plain like artificial mountains. These were the ziggurats, the temple platforms that served as homes for the gods and meeting places between heaven and earth, and life in these cities followed rhythms that would be recognizable to us in some ways and utterly alien in others. Farmers worked the fields that fed the population. Craftsmen created goods from pottery to jewelry. Merchants traded along river routes that connected city to city priests and priestesses, performed rituals to keep the gods favorable and the cosmos in order. Kings and councils governed according to laws that were written down for all to see. But underlying all of this every aspect of Sumerian life was a belief system, a way of understanding the universe that shaped everything they did. And this brings us to the Sumerian cosmos, to their understanding of how reality itself was structured. And to the Sumerians, the sky was not empty space scattered with balls of burning gas. As we understand it today, the sky was the realm of the gods, visible but unreachable, a dome of lapis lazuli blue arching over the flat disk of the earth. And the universe had three main realms. There was, and the heaven above, where the greatest gods dwelt among the stars. There was Kai, the earth below, where humans and animals and plants lived out their brief lives. And there was Kur, the underworld beneath, where the dead descended to dwell in darkness forever. And these three realms were connected, and what happened in one affected the others. The gods in heaven influenced events on earth, and rituals performed on earth could reach the ears of heaven, and the dead in the underworld could sometimes send messages to the living, and the dead required offerings from their descendants, lest they become hungry ghosts who troubled the world above. And in this cosmos, the gods were not distant abstractions. They were real, present, powerful beings who demanded worship and service, and who in return provided the rains and the floods and the fertility that made life possible. And the Sumerians believed that in the earliest times the gods had walked among humans, that there had been an age before the great flood, when the boundaries between divine and mortal were not so firm. And the temples, the ziggurats, were meant to recreate this connection. Each ziggurat was a stairway, an invitation for the divine to descend a place where heaven and earth could touch, and the gods could visit their earthly homes. And humans were created according to the Sumerian texts, to serve the gods, to work the land and tend the temples and perform the rituals that kept the cosmic order functioning. Before humans existed, the gods themselves had to labor, and they grew tired and complained, and so they created humanity as a workforce to take over the burdens of existence. And everything in this cosmos was governed by what the Sumerians called the me. And the me were divine decrees or powers or principles that governed every aspect of civilization and existence. There were me for kingship, and me for priesthood, and me then for music, and me for truth, and me for falsehood, and me for war, and me for peace, and me for the crafts, and me for the scribal arts. And whoever possessed the me for a particular domain had power over that domain. and the me were often objects that could be held and stolen and given. And the myths are full of stories about gods competing for possession of the me. And this was the Sumerian world, a world of rivers and cities and tablets and temples, a world where the gods were close and powerful and concerned with human affairs, a world where everything that mattered was written down and preserved in clay, and at the center of this divine hierarchy stood a group of beings whose name echoes down through history. To our present day, the Anunnaki, and the name Anunnaki appears in texts spanning more than 2,000 years from the earliest Sumerian. Writings to late Babylonian compositions and scholars have long debated what the name actually means. Some translate it as princely offspring or those of royal seed, suggesting they were the children of in the sky. Others have proposed more elaborate translations, and in more recent times, writers outside the academic mainstream have suggested it means those who from heaven to earth came. But whatever the name originally meant, the Anunnaki were clearly important. They were the great gods, the powers that controlled the cosmos and determined the fates of gods and humans alike. And in different texts, their number varies dramatically. Some texts speak of 50 Anunnaki, while others mention 300 in heaven and 300 in the underworld, for a total of 600, and they are associated with both realms, sitting in judgment in heaven, and presiding over the realm of the dead below. And among the Anunnaki were the most powerful figures in the Sumerian pantheon. There was An, himself, the Sky Father, the ultimate authority. Though he was often distant and uninvolved in earthly affairs, there was Enlil, the Lord of Wind and Command, who governed the earth, and whose word was law. There was Enki, also called Ea, the Lord of Wisdom and Fresh Water, who was often friendly to humanity and who saved the human race from the Great Flood. There was Ninhursag, the great mother goddess who helped create humanity from clay. And there was Inanna, the goddess of love and war, whose descent to the underworld is one of the great myths of ancient literature. And these were not mere spirits or abstract forces. They were described as beings who ate and drank and slept and loved and hated and fought. They had bodies and wore clothes and lived in houses, and they possessed objects of power, scepters and crowns, and weapons, and among the powers attributed to them was a weapon unlike anything else in ancient literature, a weapon whose descriptions span multiple texts and multiple centuries, a weapon that could, according to those ancient scribes, level mountains and reshape the face of the earth. And to find these descriptions, we must turn to the clay tablets themselves, to voices preserved in silence for 5,000 years, waiting to tell us their secrets. So much has been lost to time. Whole libraries have crumbled. Whole civilizations have vanished. Whole languages have been forgotten. But the clay remembers. The clay always remembers. For thousands of years, the clay tablets lay buried beneath the sands of what is now Iraq, is silent witnesses to a civilization that the modern world had almost entirely forgotten. Their wedge-shaped marks holding secrets that no living person could read until the 19th century, when a remarkable series of discoveries would bring the voices of ancient Mesopotamia back from oblivion and change forever our understanding of human history. The story of how we came to know what the Sumerians wrote begins not in the ancient world, but in the age of Victorian exploration, when European adventurers and scholars descended upon the Middle East with shovels and ambition, seeking the physical evidence of civilizations mentioned in the Bible and classical texts. Among the most important of these figures was Austen Henry Layard, a British traveller and archaeologist who in the 1840s began excavating the Great Mound of Kuyunjik near the city of Mosul, and what he found there would exceed anything he could have imagined. For beneath the earth lay the ruins of Nineveh, the ancient capital of the Assyrian Empire, and within those ruins was a treasure beyond price. Layard and his successors, including the brilliant Hormuzd Rassam, an Assyrian-born archaeologist who would become one of the most important figures in the recovery of Mesopotamian heritage, uncovered the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, who had ruled in the 7th century before the Common Era and who had been obsessed with collecting the written knowledge of his world. This library contained over 30,000 clay tablets, each one covered in the strange wedge-shaped script that scholars would come to call cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge. And these tablets represented the single largest collection of ancient Mesopotamian texts ever discovered, a treasury of literature, science, religion, and history that had been waiting in darkness for over 2,500 years. But finding the tablets was only the beginning, for no one in the modern world could read the script in which they were written, and so began one of the greatest intellectual detective stories in history, the decipherment of cuneiform, a process that would take decades and require the combined efforts of scholars from multiple nations working on multiple ancient languages simultaneously. The key figure in cracking the code was Henry Rawlinson, a British army officer and Orientalist who painstakingly copied and analysed the great trilingual inscription at Behistun in Persia, where the ancient King Darius had carved his proclamations in 3 languages using cuneiform script. And by comparing these 3 versions, Rawlinson and other scholars, including Edward Hincks and Jules Oppert, were gradually able to unlock the secrets of the script and begin reading what the ancient Mesopotamians had written. When the tablets from Ashurbanipal's library could finally be read, the contents sent shockwaves through Victorian society, for among the texts was an account of a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity, an account that bore unmistakable similarities to the story of Noah in the book of Genesis. And when George Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist working at the British Museum, and translated this tablet in 1872, he reportedly became so excited that he began removing his clothes in the reading room, overwhelmed by the significance of what he had found. This was not a story invented by modern writers seeking to sensationalize ancient history. This was an authentic voice from the distant past, written down more than 1,000 years before the Hebrew Bible took its final form. And it proved that the Mesopotamian civilization had possessed a rich literary tradition that had influenced cultures across the ancient world. But the flood story was only the beginning, for as scholars translated more and more tablets over the following decades and continuing to this day, they discovered a textual landscape of astonishing breadth and depth, including myths, hymns, prayers, laments, royal inscriptions, legal codes, scientific treatises, medical texts, astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, business contracts, personal letters, and school exercises. A complete record of a civilization that had flourished for over 3,000 years. The mythological texts proved particularly fascinating, revealing creation stories that told how the gods had formed the world and humanity, how they had established the order of civilization, and how they continued to govern the cosmos through their divine will. Among the most important of these texts are the Enigma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that describes how the god Marduk defeated the primordial chaos monster Tiamat and created the world from her body, and the Atrahasis, which tells the story of human creation and the Great Flood, and the Eridu Genesis, which provides yet another account of cosmic origins and early human history. There is also the Sumerian King List, a remarkable document that records the reigns of kings from before the flood to historical times, beginning with rulers whose reigns supposedly lasted tens of thousands of years and gradually shortening to more believable lengths as history approaches the present. A text that scholars have debated endlessly, for it seems to blend myth and history in ways that challenge our modern categories. The ancients did not distinguish between history and myth as we do, for their gods were as real to them as their kings, and the stories of divine deeds were as much a part of their historical record as accounts of battles and building projects, which means that when we read these texts, we must understand that we are entering a different way of thinking about the world, one in which the boundaries between the natural and supernatural, the human and divine, were far more fluid than in our modern secular understanding. Thousands of tablets contain mythological content, and scholars have discovered that multiple versions of the same myths exist, copied and recopied across centuries and civilizations, sometimes with significant variations that show how the stories evolved over time as political and religious circumstances changed, as cities rose and fell, as one god or another gained prominence in the ever-shifting landscape of Mesopotamian religion. Translation itself is an act of interpretation, and interpretations can differ dramatically. For ancient Sumerian and Akkadian are dead languages whose precise nuances are sometimes unclear, and many texts are fragmentary or damaged, requiring scholars to fill in gaps based on parallel passages or educated guesswork, which means that the translations you read in books are always, to some degree, the product of scholarly judgment rather than absolute certainty. Among these texts, certain passages stand out for their remarkable descriptions of events and objects that seem to exceed the expected scope of ancient imagination. Passages that describe divine weapons of terrible power, weapons capable of devastating entire landscapes, of flattening mountains, of reducing cities to ash, of ending wars with single catastrophic strikes. And it is to these passages that we now turn our attention. The most extensive descriptions of divine weapons come from a text called the Lugal-I, which translates roughly as "O King," a lengthy Sumerian composition of over 700 lines that describes the exploits of the god Ninurta, the divine warrior and champion of the gods, and his battle against a monstrous enemy called Azag and the stone warriors of the mountains. In this text, Ninurta wields a weapon called Sharur, a name that has been translated as mace or smasher. But the descriptions of this weapon go far beyond what we would expect from a simple club or bludgeon. For Sharur is described as a living entity, capable of speech and independent action, able to fly across vast distances and possessing the power to devastate everything in its path. The Anzu myth provides another detailed account of divine weaponry, it telling the story of how the monstrous bird Anzu stole the tablets of destiny from the god Enlil, and how Ninurta was sent to recover them, battling the creature with weapons that produced overwhelming force, blinding light, and devastating destruction. The great Babylonian epic Enuma Elish describes how Marduk armed himself before his battle with Tiamat, gathering weapons that included lightning, flame, and an irresistible net, and how his victory was so complete that he reshaped the very structure of the cosmos. What is remarkable about these descriptions is their consistency across multiple independent texts composed over centuries. For again and again we find references to weapons that radiate, that burn, that produce light so bright it cannot be withstood, that flatten mountains and level cities, that leave the land changed and devastated in their wake. The texts do not describe swords or spears. They describe something different, something that radiated, something that burned, something that overwhelmed all opposition, not through skilled combat, but through sheer devastating force. Whether metaphor or memory, the descriptions are remarkably consistent, and they raise questions that scholars have been debating for over a century. The mainstream academic interpretation of these passages treats them as poetic descriptions of natural forces, arguing that the ancient Mesopotamians were personifying the power of thunderstorms, floods, earthquakes, and other natural phenomena, clothing the terrifying forces of nature in the language of divine weaponry because they had no other framework for understanding such overwhelming power. In this view, the Anunnaki and other gods represent cosmic forces rather than literal beings, and their weapons represent meteorological and geological events rather than actual technology, a reading that fits well with our understanding of how ancient peoples typically made sense of their world. Zecharia Sitchin, a controversial author who published a series of books beginning in 1976, proposed a radically different interpretation, arguing that the Anunnaki were not mythological figures, but actual extraterrestrial visitors who came to Earth from a distant planet, bringing with them advanced technology that the ancient Sumerians could only describe in terms of gods and divine power. Sitchin's translations and interpretations have been sharply criticized by mainstream Assyriologists, who argue that he misread the cuneiform texts and imposed modern concepts onto ancient material. Yet his work has brought widespread attention to these ancient texts and inspired many to examine the primary sources for themselves. The truth, as with most ancient mysteries, likely lies somewhere between dismissal and sensationalism. For we cannot simply accept every alternative theory as fact, nor can we dismiss every anomalous passage as meaningless metaphor, and the honest approach is to present the material as clearly as possible while acknowledging the limits of our understanding. We are not here to tell you what to believe. We are here to show you what was written, to let the ancient voices speak as clearly as translation allows, and to invite you to contemplate these remarkable passages with an open mind and a critical eye. Academic Assyriology has well-established interpretive frameworks that have produced profound insights into Mesopotamian civilization, and these scholarly perspectives deserve respect and serious consideration. Yet scholarship itself is an ongoing conversation rather than a fixed set of conclusions, and new discoveries and interpretations continue to emerge as more tablets are translated and more evidence is gathered. What we know for certain is that these texts exist, that they are genuinely ancient, that they describe divine beings called the Anunnaki, who possessed weapons of extraordinary power, and that the descriptions of these weapons are remarkably consistent and detailed across multiple independent sources. What we speculate about, what remains open to interpretation and debate is what these descriptions actually meant to the people who wrote them down. Whether they were purely imaginative, whether they reflected some actual experience or memory, whether they contain encoded information that we have not yet learned to read correctly. With this foundation in place, with an understanding of how these texts came to light and how scholars have approached them, let us journey deeper into the mythology of the Anunnaki themselves, into the stories of divine families and cosmic conflicts, of weapons forged in heaven and battles that shook the earth, of gods who came down from the sky and shaped the destiny of humanity. The scribes are long dead, and the cities are dust, but the words remain patient, waiting to be read again. And tonight we will read them together, following the trail of wedge-shaped marks that lead back through 5,000 years to the beginning of written memory. Let us journey now into the heart of Sumerian theology, into the divine family that ruled heaven and earth. For to understand the weapons that could flatten mountains, we must first understand those who wielded them. And the Anunnaki were not a unified pantheon of peace. They were a family with all the complexity that implies. They loved, they hated, they schemed, and they fought with weapons that shook the world. At the apex of this divine hierarchy sat An, whose name simply meant sky, the father of the gods, supreme in authority yet strangely distant from earthly affairs, and dwelt in the highest heaven, remote and magnificent. And while all the gods acknowledged his supremacy, it was not An who commanded the day-to-day operations of the cosmos. That responsibility fell to his son, Enlil, Lord of the Wind, whose very breath was the storm, whose word was law among both gods and mortals. Enlil was the executive power of the universe, the commander of the Anunnaki Council, the one who assigned destinies and dispensed fates, and his city was Nippur, the spiritual center of Sumer, where no king could rule legitimately without receiving Enlil's blessing, where the great temple Akor rose toward heaven like a mountain made by hands. But power shared is power contested, and alongside Enlil stood his brother Enki, called Ea in later Akkadian texts, the lord of wisdom and sweet waters, whose domain was the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth. And if Enlil was the stern father of gods and men, Enki was the clever uncle, the trickster, the friend of humanity, who again and again intervened to save mortals from destruction. It was Enki who warned the hero of the flood, Enki who created the first humans from clay, Enki whose cunning balanced Enlil's severity. Then there was Ninhursag, the Great Mother, called by many names across the millennia, Ki, Ninmah, Nintu, the Lady of the Mountains, the womb of life itself. And the texts tell us that it was Ninhursag, working alongside Enki, who shaped the first humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, fashioning servants for the Anunnaki, workers who would tend the earth and offer sacrifice. These were the elders of the divine council, the first generation, but beneath them rose a younger generation whose ambitions would reshape both heaven and earth. There was Ninurta, a son of Enlil, the divine warrior, champion of the gods, whose exploits filled tablet after tablet with tales of cosmic battle. And there was Inanna, called Ishtar by the Babylonians, goddess of love and war, whose fierce beauty and fiercer temper made her the most dynamic deity in the pantheon, the one who descended to the underworld and returned, the one who stole the divine decrees from Enki himself through cunning and intoxication. There was Nergal, lord of the underworld, king of the land of no return, whose pestilence and plague walked the earth at his command. And there was Marduk, son of Enki, who would in later centuries rise to supremacy as Babylon rose to empire, absorbing the powers and attributes of all the elder gods into his 50 sacred names. This is essential to understand. The mythology was not static. It evolved over millennia as earthly politics shifted, as cities rose and fell, as empires conquered and were conquered in turn. When Babylon dominated Mesopotamia, Marduk became king of the gods. When Assyria ruled, their god Ashur took prominence, and scholars have traced these theological shifts through the layers of textual revision, watching the divine family restructure itself to mirror earthly power. Different cities served different patron deities. Ur belonged to the moon god Nana, Uruk to Inanna, Eridu to Enki. And this divine patronage meant that wars between cities were also wars between gods, that political alliances had theological dimensions, that the fate of temples and the fate of kingdoms were one and the same. The Anunnaki functioned as a council. The texts describe them gathering to debate, to judge, to assign fates, and their decisions were binding upon reality itself. When the Anunnaki decreed something, it became true. This was the nature of divine speech, words that could not be contradicted, fates that could not be escaped. But councils breed factions, and factions breed conflict, and the mythological texts are filled with divine rivalries, with gods scheming against gods, with weapons raised and battles fought that shook the foundations of the cosmos. Among all these divine figures, one stands out as the warrior supreme, and his name was Ninurta. Son of Enlil, heir to the Lord of the Wind, Ninurta embodied the principle of divine violence in service of cosmic order. He was the champion who rose when chaos threatened, the hero who took up arms when monsters emerged from the primordial deep. And his mythology is among the richest and most detailed in the entire Sumerian corpus. The texts describe Ninurta in vivid terms, powerful beyond measure, clothed in radiance, riding upon the storms, and at his side always was his weapon, the instrument that made him invincible, called Sharur, a name that scholars translate as the Smasher, or the one that smashes thousands. And Sharur was not merely a tool, it was a companion. The texts describe it as a living thing, a weapon that could speak, that could think, that could advise its wielder in the heat of battle. Consider how extraordinary this concept is. A weapon with voice, with personality, with loyalty. Sharur spoke to Ninurta, encouraged him when he faltered, scouted ahead, and returned with intelligence about enemies. And when released, it flew to its target with devastating precision, producing what the texts call a radiance that could not be withstood, a brilliance that overwhelmed all resistance. The Anzu myth tells us of Ninurta's first great trial. Anzu was a monstrous bird, lion-headed and eagle-winged, who served in the chamber of Enlil. And one day, while Enlil bathed, Anzu stole the tablets of destiny, those sacred objects that contained all the divine decrees, all the mess that governed reality itself. And with them, Anzu seized control of fate, making himself invincible, making his word supreme. Chaos threatened the cosmos. The gods gathered in council and despaired, for whoever held the tablets could not be defeated by ordinary means. And it was Ninurta who stepped forward. Ninurta who armed himself with Sharur and pursued Anzu to the mountains. Yes, and there, in a battle that the texts describe in vivid detail, the young god faced the cosmic thief. 3 times Ninurta hurled his weapons, and 3 times the power of the tablets turned them back. But finally, guided by Sharur's counsel, Ninurta found a way to overcome the stolen power. He struck Anzu down and recovered the tablets of destiny, returning them to Enlil and restoring cosmic order. This victory established Ninurta as the supreme champion of the gods, the one called upon when all other powers failed, and his cult spread throughout Mesopotamia. Temples rose in his honor, hymns celebrated his might, and scribes composed ever longer accounts of his heroic deeds, culminating in the great composition known as the Lugal-i, meaning "O King," a text of over 700 lines that recounts Ninurta's war against the mountains themselves. The Lugal-i describes a threat unlike any other in Sumerian mythology, a demon named Azag, whose name means enchanter or possibly arm raiser, had united the stones of the mountains into an army. The very rocks had come alive, risen against the gods, and Azag led them in a rebellion that threatened to overturn the cosmic order. The mountains themselves had become enemies, chaos in its most literal form. The solid earth turned hostile. When the gods learned of this uprising, they were terrified. Even Enlil hesitated, for what weapon could prevail against living stone, against an army that felt no pain, that needed no food, that could not be broken by ordinary force? And again, it was Ninurta who answered the call, arming himself with Sharur and journeying to the rebellious mountains to face Azag and his lithic legions. The text describes the weapon's activation in terms that arrest the modern reader, a radiance that spread across the land, a brilliance that made the mountains tremble before it even struck. And when Sharur was released, it did not merely wound, it devastated, it unmade. The living stones were shattered, Azag himself was broken, and the mountains that had risen in rebellion were flattened, reduced, transformed from towering peaks to submissive plains. When the battle ended, the landscape itself had been transformed. Ninurta did not simply defeat his enemies, he reshaped geography. And the latter portion of the Lugal-i describes how the victorious god reorganized the waterways of Mesopotamia, channeling the rivers, establishing irrigation, turning the chaos of his battlefield into the ordered fertility that sustained civilization. This is theological agriculture. The storm god who brings devastation also brings the rains that water the fields, destruction and creation flowing from the same divine source. But Ninurta was not alone in possessing weapons of such terrible power. Other Anunnaki held instruments of devastation in their own right, and the texts describe an arsenal of divine armaments that could reshape reality itself. Ishkur, called Adad in Akkadian, was the storm god proper, wielding lightning and thunder as his weapons. And when he rode forth, the clouds gathered, the winds howled, the rains fell in torrents that could drown cities. His weapon was the very storm, directed and intensified beyond natural limits, a controlled apocalypse that could be aimed at enemies of the divine order. Nergal, lord of the underworld, commanded weapons appropriate to his grim domain. Pestilence and plague marched at his word. Fever and death spread where he directed them. And in certain texts, Nergal too possesses weapons of fire and destruction, appropriate to a deity who rules the land beneath, the realm of the dead, the kingdom from which no traveler returns. And then there was Marduk, who in the great Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish defeats the primordial chaos goddess Tiamat, using an arsenal of cosmic weapons. Marduk arms himself with bow and mace, with lightning and net, with the four winds and the seven storms, and when he faces Tiamat, he releases the evil wind, the sandstorm, the whirlwind, filling her body with devastating force before splitting her in two and fashioning heaven and earth from her corpse. The tablets of destiny recur throughout these mythologies as the ultimate source of power. Whoever possessed them possessed authority over fate itself, over the decrees that governed reality. And again the texts describe conflicts over these tablets, stolen by Anzu, recovered by Ninurta, claimed by Marduk after his victory, passed from god to god as supremacy shifted. Scholars have noted the common vocabulary that appears across all these divine weapon descriptions, words suggesting radiance, brilliance, light that cannot be endured, burning heat, overwhelming sound, dust clouds that block the sun, and whether these represent poetic descriptions of storms and natural forces or something else entirely, remains one of the great interpretive questions of ancient Near Eastern studies. The Anunnaki were not merely powerful, they were armed with instruments that could reshape reality, that could flatten mountains, that could redirect rivers, that could unmake what existed and create what had never been. And the texts describe their use in wars that changed the very face of the earth. Gods and monsters, weapons and wars, the Sumerians wrote it all down, pressing their wedge-shaped styluses into soft clay that would harden and endure for millennia, preserving voices from the dawn of civilization, preserving accounts of beings called the Anunnaki, and the terrible instruments they wielded. And perhaps they did this because they wanted us to remember, wanted us to know what they had witnessed or what their ancestors had witnessed, wanted the stories to survive even when the cities crumbled and the temples fell and the last scribe pressed the last tablet and laid down his stylus for the final time. They wanted us to remember. And so we do. Now we come to the heart of our journey and the moment when we must look directly at what the ancient scribes actually wrote. Because the clay tablets do not speak in vague generalities or misty suggestions, but in words that have survived 50 centuries of silence. And these words describe something extraordinary. Let us begin with the Lugal-E itself, that great composition of 728 lines that scholars have pieced together from fragments found across multiple archaeological sites. And when we read the passages describing Ninurta's weapon in action against the mountain forces, we encounter language that stops us in contemplation. The text reads like a storm it roared, like a fire it burned, like a flood it swept away all resistance. These are not casual descriptions of a Bronze Age battle fought with copper swords and wooden shields, but accounts of something that operated on an entirely different scale. The Sumerian scribes used specific terminology that modern translators have labored to understand, and at the center of these descriptions we find the word Sharur, the name of Ninurta's weapon, a term whose precise meaning remains debated among Assyriologists to this day. And some translate it as the one who makes tremble, while others suggest it means the mower down or the smasher. But all agree that the texts portray Sharur not as a simple tool of war, but as something possessing its own radiance, its own voice, its own terrible will. Alongside Sharur, we encounter another crucial Sumerian concept called Melamu or Melam, which describes a supernatural radiant aura that surrounded the gods and their weapons, a luminous, terrifying brilliance that no mortal could withstand. When Ninurta unleashed his weapon against the mountains, the texts tell us this Milam spread across the land like a blinding fire that made enemies fall before it without even being struck. Consider the specificity of what the scribes recorded. They do not merely say the mountains were defeated or conquered, but that they were flattened, broken down, reduced to rubble, with the very landscape transformed by the weapon's power. One passage describes how the weapon made the mountains bow down low, how it scattered the stones across the plain, how nothing could stand against its radiance. Another text from the Anzu myth uses remarkably similar language when describing how the gods defeated the lion-headed stormbird who had stolen the tablets of destiny. In that account, we read of weapons that filled the sky with fire, that roared with voices like thunder, that left devastation where they struck. The parallels extend further still into the Babylonian Enigma Elish, where Marduk arms himself for battle against the primordial chaos. Dragon Tiamat with an arsenal that includes the evil wind, the whirlwind, the hurricane, the fourfold wind, the sevenfold wind, the cyclone, and the matchless wind, along with a net given him by his father Anu, and most intriguingly, something called the lightning bolt that he filled with flame. These are not descriptions of conventional weapons, and the consistency across independent texts spanning hundreds of years suggests the scribes were drawing on a common tradition, a shared memory or belief about divine instruments of overwhelming power. What strikes the careful reader is not just the power described, but the effects on the environment itself. Changed waterways, scattered mountains, landscapes permanently altered. The scribes wrote as if these were historical events that explained the geography they lived in. But what could such a weapon have been? And here, we must consider the interpretations that scholars have proposed over the past century and a half of studying these texts. The most widely accepted academic explanation frames these descriptions as poetic metaphors for natural forces, particularly storms. And this interpretation has considerable merit. Ninurta was associated with the spring thunderstorms that brought life-giving rain to Mesopotamia, and the violence of such storms, with their lightning and thunder and flooding waters, could indeed flatten fields and reshape waterways. In this reading, the mountain weapon becomes a literary device for describing the storm god's power over nature, the way violent weather could break down hillsides and carve new paths for rivers. Similarly, some scholars propose that these myths preserve cultural memories of natural disasters, volcanic eruptions that ancient peoples witnessed, earthquakes that toppled mountains, catastrophic floods that reshaped the land. The ancient mind, lacking our scientific framework, would naturally interpret such events as divine action, as weapons wielded by gods in cosmic battles. A third interpretation suggests political metaphor, that the cosmic conflicts described in these texts reflect actual wars between city-states, with the gods standing in for human armies and their weapons representing military campaigns. When Babylon rose to power, the myths were rewritten to elevate Marduk above older gods, like Enlil and Ninurta, suggesting these stories served political purposes as much as religious ones. There is also the psychological interpretation favored by some modern scholars, who see in these myths expressions of the collective unconscious, universal archetypes of power and destruction that emerge in human storytelling across all cultures. The mountain weapon, in this view, represents humanity's deep awareness of forces beyond our control, our primal fear and awe before nature's destructive potential made narrative. Each of these interpretations offers genuine insight and explains much of what we find in the texts, yet certain details resist easy naturalistic explanation. Perhaps the Sumerians were simply describing the awesome power of nature clothed in the language of the divine. And yet, the precision of the descriptions, the consistency across sources, the sense that the scribes were recording something they believed to be literally true, gives pause. Why would multiple texts independently describe weapons with radiant auras that could be seen from great distances? Why the emphasis on sound so loud it shattered mountains? Why the repeated insistence that landscapes were permanently changed? Other researchers have proposed more radical interpretations that venture far from mainstream academic consensus. And while we must approach these theories with appropriate skepticism, they have captured the imagination of many who study these ancient texts. In 1976, a scholar named Zecharia Sitchin published a book called The 12th Planet, in which he proposed that the Anunnaki were not mythological beings at all, but extraterrestrial visitors from a planet he called Nibiru, a world whose elongated orbit brings it through our solar system every 3,600 years. Sitchin claimed to read the Sumerian texts as literal historical accounts of these beings arriving on Earth, establishing settlements, and eventually creating humanity through genetic engineering to serve as workers in their gold mining operations. In his interpretation, the mountain weapons were not metaphors, but actual advanced technology, perhaps nuclear or plasma-based weapons that these visitors deployed in conflicts among themselves. His translations of key Sumerian terms have been challenged by mainstream Assyriology, and most academic scholars reject his interpretive framework entirely, pointing to errors in his understanding of cuneiform and Sumerian grammar. Yet whatever the validity of his specific claims, Sitchin's work brought these ancient texts to popular attention and raised questions that continue to resonate. We present these theories not as truth, but as possibilities that have captured many imaginations. Other researchers working independently have proposed similar ideas, suggesting that descriptions of divine weapons, flying vehicles, and advanced knowledge in ancient texts worldwide might preserve memories of technologies that existed before recorded history, perhaps from a lost civilization, perhaps from contact with beings we do not yet understand. Some point to sites like Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, where archaeologists found skeletons in the streets as if death came suddenly, and where some stones appear vitrified, fused by intense heat. Though the cause of this ancient city's destruction remains genuinely mysterious, there are layers of melted and fused rock at various ancient sites around the world that conventional archaeology struggles to explain. And while this does not prove ancient atomic weapons existed, it reminds us that our knowledge of the past remains incomplete. The honest answer is, we do not know what the Sumerians were describing, and we may never know with certainty. Critics of alternative theories rightly point out that absence of evidence is not evidence of presence, that we cannot simply assume advanced technology existed because we find descriptions that sound technological to modern ears. But the same principle works in reverse. Absence of evidence is also not evidence of absence. And our inability to explain something does not mean it was merely imagination. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between the extremes, between complete dismissal and uncritical acceptance. Let us consider what we can reasonably conclude as we step back from both the conventional interpretations and the more radical proposals. First, we can say with certainty that these texts exist. They are not modern inventions or internet hoaxes, but genuine ancient documents written on clay tablets that have been excavated by professional archaeologists, catalogued in museums around the world, and studied by generations of scholars. The words are real, even if their meaning remains debated. Second, we can observe that these texts describe weapons whose power exceeds anything we might expect from Bronze Age military technology. Whether this represents poetic exaggeration, metaphorical language, preserved memory of natural disasters, or something else entirely, remains an open question, but the descriptions themselves are remarkable by any standard. Third, we can note that the Sumerians who wrote these texts believed them to be true accounts of their gods and their history. They were not writing fiction in our modern sense, but recording what they understood to be the nature of reality, the actions of beings they worshipped and feared, the origins of the world they inhabited. Whatever inspired these accounts, the scribes set them down with conviction and care. Fourth, we can acknowledge that despite over a century of scholarship, many fundamental questions about these texts remain unanswered. Why do independent sources show such consistency? Or what experiences led the Sumerians to develop these specific ideas? Why do certain details resist easy naturalistic interpretation? These questions deserve our continued attention and wonder. The Sumerians pressed these words into clay because they wanted them preserved forever, and they succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. 50 centuries later, their accounts of the Anunnaki and their terrible weapons still speak to us, still provoke our curiosity, still invite our contemplation. What we make of their testimony, whether we see metaphor or memory, poetry or history, imagination or something stranger still, is a choice each of us must make in the quiet of our own contemplation. 5,000 years ago, someone sat in a temple and wrote these words about weapons that could flatten mountains, about radiant power that transformed the land, about divine beings who wielded forces beyond mortal understanding. Tonight, you have read them, and in that reading across all those centuries and all that distance the circle closes, the voice speaks again, the clay remembers. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through the ancient world, though perhaps it is not truly an end, but simply a resting place along a path that stretches forward into whatever comes next for those who carry these stories with them. In museums around the world today, in London and Paris and Berlin and Baghdad, the clay tablets of Mesopotamia rest in climate-controlled cases, their wedge-shaped marks preserved under soft light, waiting for visitors who pause before them and wonder what voices they contain. School children press their faces close to the glass, seeing only strange patterns in brown clay, not yet knowing that these are among the oldest written words in human existence, that the hands which pressed these marks did so more than 5,000 years ago when the world was young, and the gods, they believed, still walked among mortals. Scholars spend entire careers learning to read these ancient scripts, dedicating decades to understanding languages that have not been spoken aloud for millennia. And still, they find texts they cannot fully explain. passages that resist easy interpretation, descriptions of powers and weapons that seem to exceed what Bronze Age peoples should have known. These ancient scribes were, in their way, asking the same questions we ask today. Where do we come from, and what powers govern our lives, and what forces exist that could destroy everything we have built? And in their questions, we hear echoes of our own, for humanity has always wondered about its origins, has always sensed that there are forces in the universe far greater than ourselves, has always tried to make sense of destruction and creation and the thin line that separates the two. The Anunnaki, whatever they truly were, represent something fundamental in the human experience, the awareness that we are small beings in a vast cosmos, that powers exist beyond our comprehension, that the mountains which seem eternal can be reduced to rubble by forces we cannot control. Whether these ancient Mesopotamians were describing storms and earthquakes dressed in divine clothing, or preserving memories of technologies we cannot imagine, or simply telling stories that help them process the terrifying power of the natural world. Their words have outlasted empires and survived catastrophes and crossed the barrier of 5,000 years to reach us here tonight. And so, we come to rest at the edge of the unknown, having traveled so far through time and myth and mystery. The clay tablets lie in museums now, silent under glass. But if you know how to read them, they still speak, still whisper of Ninurta and his radiant weapon, still tell of mountains that trembled and fell, still preserve the voices of scribes who believed they were recording the true history of the gods. We have followed those voices tonight, from the reed marshes of ancient Sumer to the libraries of Nineveh, from the moment cuneiform was first pressed into wet clay to the ongoing work of scholars who still struggle to understand everything the ancients wrote. We have met the Anunnaki in their complexity, not simple deities, but a divine family with all the drama and rivalry and terrible power that such a family might possess. We have examined the weapons they were said to wield, instruments of devastation that could flatten mountains and reshape the very land. And we have considered what these descriptions might mean, weighing the interpretations of scholars against the theories of those who propose more radical explanations. The truth, as with so many ancient mysteries, may never be fully known, and perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps the mystery itself has value. Perhaps not everything needs to be solved and explained and filed away. The Sumerians gave us writing, the greatest gift any civilization has ever given to those who came after. And with writing, they gave us these stories, these questions, these windows into a world so distant it might as well be another planet, and yet so familiar in its concerns that we recognize ourselves in every line. The Anunnaki may have flattened mountains with their terrible weapons, or perhaps the scribes were describing the awesome power of thunderstorms and earthquakes, or perhaps the truth is something stranger still, something we lack the framework to understand. But the words of those who wrote about them have outlasted any mountain, have survived when the ziggurats crumbled and the cities turned to dust, and the rivers changed their courses, and civilizations rose and fell and rose again. 5,000 years is a long time, long enough for everything to change, and yet not long enough for these ancient questions to lose their power. Tonight, you have heard them asked again, in a new language, in a new age, under the same stars that shone over and Uruk and Eridu when the first scribes picked up their styluses. Sleep now, and perhaps dream of ancient temples rising from river plains, of scribes working by lamplight to preserve what they believed was sacred truth, of voices in clay whispering across the ages, telling us of gods who came from the sky and the terrible, beautiful, mountain-shattering power they possessed. The stars wheel overhead, as they always have. The rivers still flow through the land between them, though their names have changed and their courses have shifted. And somewhere, in a museum basement, in a drawer that has not been opened in years, a clay tablet waits in darkness, holding secrets we have not yet learned to read, patient as only clay can be, ready to speak whenever someone learns to listen. Rest now. Let the ancient voices fade to silence. Let the mystery remain, warm and present, a companion for your dreams. The Sumerians wrote their words in clay because they wanted them to last forever. They succeeded, and now their words have found you, here, tonight, at the end of a journey 5,000 years in the making. Good night.